What is up, Spill It Squad? It is your boy Andrew, coming at you with Democracy Part 2, Electric Boogaloo. What's up? So, I'm just gonna jump right on in, pick up where we left off last time. So, last time you may remember, I was basically leading us into, basically the basic history of American democracy. And last we talked about, by the late 1800s, average citizens were like, hey, the government's just being ruled by the rich and corporate people. So they were like, okay, fine, we'll expand voting rights and allow people to vote on some of the policies, maybe. So, anywho, we're going to jump right on this. Prior to the 18th century, parties and factions actually, in a lot of people's minds, were undermining the stability of the government because, it's hard to get things done, there's too much arguing, the government's going to shut down on us, and we see this constantly today. I talked about this the last time, but inevitably when you have political parties, and especially in the United States where we only have two major parties, you hear a lot in American election cycles talking about, it's the lesser of two evils, you gotta vote for the lesser of two evils. So it's we have two parties, we have Democrats and Republicans. Democrats always inevitably frame themselves as the left, broadly, and Republicans frame themselves as the right, broadly. However, there is this thing called the Overton window, which is the acceptable range of political discourse in a society, and over the last 40 or so years, since Reagan especially, that Overton window in the United States has shifted more and more to the right every day. So we inevitably see the situation right now where Democrats and Republicans are both different extremes of the right wing. So, Republicans, we see them delving further and further into fascism, and we see Democrats trailing behind, but not necessarily all the time anyways. Certain cases, you have the progressive wings who might be more, but most people are just trying to maintain the status quo. Maintaining that status quo still falls into at least center-right policies, at least in the global scale. That's why I have to emphasize that in the global scale. If we look at Democrats in most of Western Europe, they're like, yeah, that's our center-right party. So I want to explain where I'm coming from in that perspective. So as I said, the U.S., many people rank it as a flawed democracy. And here's one really good example of that. When we look at Congress, the Senate, they disproportionately favor the small states. Because in the United States, every state gets 2 senators. So 2 senators means California's getting 2 senators, Ohio's getting 2 senators, bumfuck Vermont, that's getting 2 senators. Everybody's getting 2 senators, no matter what size. So Republicans do tend to be centered in those smaller states, and they hold 35 Senate seats compared to 25 Democratic seats in the smallest 30 states as of 2018. But the largest 20 states have 24 Dems and only 16 Republicans. So half of Democrats in the Senate make up large states, but 2/3 of Republican senators represent the smallest 30% of, or the smallest 30 states. Sorry. 51 Republicans represented about 143 million people, and 49 Democrats represented 182 million people. So there were 2.8 million people per Republican to 3.7 million people per Democrat being represented. That is according to CNN. So Democrats overall, they are representing more people per person, per senator. In terms of proportional power, for example, a person in Wyoming has 68 times more influence in the United States Senate than a person in California. California has over 39.5 million residents, meaning there's about 1 senator for every 19.8 million Californians. But in Wyoming, the population is less than 600,000 people, so there's 1 senator for every 289,000 Wyomingans. So we start seeing those divides look pretty stark, don't they? So people in Wyoming, they're getting significantly more influence in our government than Californians, if we look at the Senate. The average Democratic state has 1 senator for every 3 million people. The average Republican state has 1 senator for every 1.8 million people. In other words, Republican states have roughly 1.6 times for proportional power than Democratic states do. In 2008, for example, on average, a state is rewarded one electoral vote for every 565,166 people. However, Wyoming has 3 electoral votes and only 532,668 votes, or citizens, as of 2008 estimates. So, as a result, each of Wyoming's 3 electoral votes corresponds to 177,556 people. Those people have 3.8 times as much clout in the Electoral College as the average American. So it's like, how does that sound very democratic, you know? It doesn't seem too democratic if different people get different levels of pull when it comes to influencing our decisions as a country. In a true democracy, it would be one person, one vote. It does not matter who you are, one person gets one vote, and those votes all matter the same. So it's like, for example, every election cycle, we always see some people who say, oh, your vote doesn't fucking matter. It doesn't fucking matter. If you live in a dominant Republican or Democratic state, doesn't matter what you vote because that's going to win anyway. It doesn't matter. And then other people are like, no, your vote definitely does matter. It definitely does influence things. And I can see in certain instances, like if you're in a purple state, like one of those swing states, like they always talk about like 7 or 8 states like every election cycle, like, oh, these are the states you gotta watch out for, right? And it's like, I'm also looking at like, if 7 or 8 states are like the big determining factors, again, it kind of seems like those states have a little more sway in deciding how the country gets to function compared to average people, right? So, like, that's what I'm looking at. I don't necessarily say that your vote matters as much as people think it does, but I don't think it's completely worth writing off. Like, at the end of the day, my philosophy on voting is like, if you have the means to do it, if it's easy and accessible for you to do it, do it. Like, why not? Like, me, for example, if anything, use your vote to vote for to vote on behalf of the people who are barred from voting, which we will get to here in just a minute. Because there's a lot of ways in which people are barred from voting. Sometimes it's overt, sometimes it's subtle, but like I said, we'll get there in a second. Another thing I found, according to a 2014 study out of Princeton, the U.S. is actually an oligarchy, and you've probably been hearing that a lot, especially with AOC and Bernie Sanders doing their take down the oligarchy tour, or whatever the fuck they're calling it, I don't know. And what's an oligarchy? An oligarchy is when a few rich elites basically are in charge of everything. It's just a few people who are in charge of all of the decision making. So let's look at this as an example. According to the BBC, a proposed policy change with low support among economically elite Americans, 1 out of 5 in favor, meaning if 1 out of 5 of the richest Americans support a policy, it's probably not going to pass because the 4 out of 5 don't support it. And it's only adopted about 18% of the time. While a proposed change with high support, 4 out of 5 in favor of the elites, it gets adopted 45% of the time. When a majority of citizens disagrees with these economic elites and or with the organized interest, they generally lose. Gotta love it. So effectively, rich people are writing our fucking laws. Rich people get a pass to do whatever they want. They get to... Because, like I said, I do want to talk about lobbying, and I'll briefly touch on that here right now, actually. So, lobbying, if you didn't know, it's basically like, you can't give a senator $100,000 and say, make this policy happen, but you can take him out to a nice expensive lunch, give him a couple nice gifts, and that's okay. It's just legalized bribery. If an average citizen tried to do that, we would get into trouble for that, but when rich people do it, that's just called lobbying, and that's just part of doing business, am I right? Moreover, because of the strong status quo bias built into U.S. politics, for example, even when fairly large majorities of Americans favor public policy, we generally don't get it. As in, I can't remember the specific numbers right off, so don't quote me, but like it'll be something like 70% of Americans actually support codifying Roe v. Wade into law, and yet we just saw it get overturned by the Supreme Court a couple years ago. like 70-75% of Americans are in favor of same-sex marriage, and yet we see people trying to peel back some of those protections in some states. You know, it's things like that. Most Americans agree that we're not making enough money to live, and yet the minimum wage hasn't risen since 2009. So we've basically been keeping the poorest people among us, the people making minimum wage in this country, at the same pay for the last 16 years. And yet most Americans agree, yeah, that's not a good thing. They should definitely be making more money so that way they can afford to, the rising cost of living that we have dealt with since 2009. And yet the rich people don't like it because that cuts into their profit, am I right? So, anywho, like I said, we're going to jump into restrictions on voting here. This is kind of part of those reasons why people may say that we are a flawed democracy. So, in the US, like I said, we have different groups who are barred from voting. Sometimes it's overt, sometimes it's subtle. One thing that I think we all know is felons in the US are barred from voting. Laws in 48 states ban people with felony convictions from voting. And in 2022, an estimated 4.4 million Americans, representing 2% of the voting age population, were ineligible to vote due to those laws and policies, according to the Sentencing Project. This is a 24% decrease since 2016, as some states have tried to remove that barrier. That said, there is still a lot of people. 3 out of 4 of these people are living in their communities. They've done their time, and they're on probation or on parole, so it's like we say prison is supposed to be like, oh, this is where you go to, pay your debt to society, and yet when people get out of prison, for some reason we still look at them like they're just evil people who are completely irredeemable. And I do want to do a video about prisons at some point, but that's for a future video. So it's just like, why are we like 75% of these people who have been to prison who are barred from voting, like they are active and positive members in their communities now. They've done their time. They're doing their thing. So why are we telling them they can't vote? Alabama and Tennessee actually see over 8% of their voting age populations ineligible to vote due to felony convictions. And Florida, gotta love Florida, is the leader in disenfranchisement, with over 1.1 million people barred, often because they cannot afford to pay court-ordered monetary sanctions. An estimated 934,500 Floridians who have completed their sentences still cannot vote. So it's like we sit here and actively say, you are not allowed to vote even though you have supposedly paid your debt to our society. Am I right? That seems weird. And to even add another layer on top of that, voter disenfranchisement and voter suppression of black communities is definitely a big issue, according to the AmericanProgress.org. And that goes in with felony convictions because, as we know, black men are more likely to be convicted of crime than white people. And, for example, 1 in 19 black voting age Americans is disenfranchised, 3.5 times the rate of non-black Americans. More than 1 in 10 black adults in Alabama, Arizona, Florida, Kentucky, South Dakota, Tennessee, and Virginia are all disenfranchised. Conservative estimates say about 500,000 Latinx Americans, 1.7% of the voting population, is barred. About 1 million women are disenfranchised, about 1/5 of the disenfranchised population. And going back to those felonies, what are we counting as felonies? Shoplifting, selling weed, forgery, disorderly conduct. I definitely know people who have definitely done some of those things, and yet they haven't been arrested. So it's like people basically effectively can make those decisions on the spot and say, yep, this is okay or this isn't okay, and we're not applying justice appropriately in this country. But like I said, people of color in states with a history of voter suppression have fewer voting locations in 2016. In 40 counties with large black community, citizens had 158 fewer early polling places, and that can lead to longer lines and wait times. And during the first week of early voting in North Carolina, African American voters' participation had declined by 16% when compared to the previous presidential election. This was in 2016. MIT found that Hispanic voters had wait times 1.5 times as long as their white counterparts, and black voters, who are more likely to have inflexible employment, to be able to take that time off to vote, have to wait nearly twice as long in lines. Those long lines deterred at least 730,000 Americans from voting in November of 2012, according to a Joint Center on Political Economic Studies report. Many states have been implementing voter ID laws, which includes only specific forms, like a CCW permit is fine in Texas, but not a student ID. In 2016, federal judges ruled that these strict laws disproportionately disenfranchise voters of color. One study specifically says that white citizens were 11.5 percentage points more likely than black citizens to have the accepted credentials, meaning those voter ID laws actively prohibit people from voting who could just be eligible to vote. And actually, in a lot of countries, you are automatically eligible to vote no matter what once you turn the voting age in the country. And it does not matter. You don't have to go and register. You don't got to do all that. You're just automatically registered. You can go vote when the election comes. Why don't we do this in the United States? That is like one major pitfall in American democracy. Like, we have to go through all these hoops and hurdles just to be able to vote and get our voice heard. Some places, in an alleged effort to prevent illegal voting, have removed names from voter registration lists, disproportionately impacting voters of color. For example, in 2012, Florida's governor and secretary of state compiled lists with 180,000 people suspected of being non-citizens and threatened to remove them from the voter rolls. About 87% of those people were voters of color. How is this democratic? We are actively telling thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, you can't vote just because we just said, I don't think you're a citizen, sweaty. You have a Mexican-sounding last name? Are you a citizen? Are you sure? That seems very suspicious to me, doesn't it? Small states, as I explained previously, are also disproportionately represented in the Senate. Those states don't tend to have nearly as much ethnic, racial, and religious diversity as the larger states, so minorities in general receive less representation in the Senate. White Christians, for example, only make up roughly 40% of the country, but they are a larger share of the small states who have the bias in the Senate. So again, those small states, which are more predominantly white Christians, get to have much more of a say than in California, where you may have more people of color who happen to be atheists, or Muslims, or Jewish, or whatever. Like, white Christians tend to get that preference in the Senate. Like I said, Wyoming has a predominantly white population, 83.7% of its population, while California has a predominantly non-white population, which is about 63.5% of its population. So the white majority population of Wyoming gets more influence than the predominantly POC population of California in the Senate rulings and votings. And we actually remember back in the day used to have tests to basically say, oh, who's eligible to vote, who's literate. We all know how that's going because all our education standards tend to be very much focused on the white male Christian standard of curriculum. So it's always heavily biased. And many people say this actually creates a hell of a lot of individualism in democracy, and democracy honestly should be more of a collective task that we strive for. Disabled people. These are also people heavily restricted because some of those voting locations are simply not accessible for people with wheelchairs. Some people with mental disabilities may be barred from voting because of state laws that bar those mental disabilities. So we don't do a good job at protecting and keeping disabled people in the loop when it comes to making our decisions as a government. Another one is poor people. Like I said, that takes the shape of lobbying. So even when poor people are able to vote, keep in mind many low-income people are in jobs that don't offer them the time to go out and vote because Election Day is on a Tuesday in the United States. It's not a public holiday. Just if you're available to go vote on a Tuesday afternoon, sure. Most people who are in those kind of jobs are probably in pretty chill positions where they can have the time to go vote and think about what they want to vote. So, for example, the Democratic Governors Association and Republican Governors Association share 48 top donors. 45 are corporations and 3 are trade associations. Both of these, all 48 of those are donating to both Democratic and Republican candidates. Corporations seek to donate heavily to both parties so their interests are secured no matter who gets in office. This is according to OpenSecrets.org. So we have donors like Comcast, Walmart, Hewlett-Packard, AT&T, Coca-Cola, Aflac, Verizon. Of those 48 donors, 16 come from the healthcare sector, 10 come from general business, 8 come from communications and electronics, 6 are from finance and insurance, 5 are from energy, 2 from agribusiness, and 1 is from the transportation sector. Looking at the top 100 non-individual donors, the Democratic Governors Association got about $28.2 million, 59% from corporations, 36% from unions, and 5% from trade associations. The Republican Governors Association got $30.5 million, 70, 28, and 2% respectively for those same categories, corporations, unions, and trade associations. A 2-year investigation by USA Today, the Arizona Republic, and Center for Republican Integrity reveals the extent to which special interests have infiltrated state legislatures using model legislation. At least 10,000 bills, almost entirely copied from model legislations in the past 8 years, and more than 2,100 of those bills were signed into law. Basically, corporations are writing laws, and some states and even the federal government are straight up just like, looks good to me, let's pass it. So about a fifth of these bills that corporations are just straight up writing are getting passed. These laws have made it harder for injured consumers to sue companies. They've levied taxes on sugary drinks. They've limited abortion access and restricted protesting rights, which is our First Amendment right. Remember that. These model legislations make it easier for lawmakers to get nearly entire bills and helps build relationships with lobbyists and campaign donors, so they can get those cushy jobs after they leave Congress. The Asbestos Transparency Act made it harder, for example, for victims exposed to asbestos to recoup money. The HOPE Act was written by conservative advocacy groups to put barriers to food stamps, but they were like, yes, we're giving hope, we're helping, is the intended consequence behind that. Special interest groups try to create false grassroots endorsement and public consensus. One guy testified in 13 states claiming to be an expert, but was from an organization who crafted legislation on behalf of the asbestos industry. Another point is, for every dollar used to lobby by special interest groups, unions, disability advocates, etc., corporate lobbyists spend 34. So corporate lobbyists are outspending small special interest groups like unions and disability advocates, for example, 34 times as much. U.S. citizens in U.S. territories are also not allowed to vote for presidents in general elections, despite literally being citizens. We have territories like D.C., Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, the Northern Mariana Islands, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. They have a combined population of over 4.2 million people, more than some states in our country, like Wyoming, Vermont, Alaska, South Dakota, Montana, combined, and more than Oregon as an individual state, yet have zero representation. Absolutely no representation in our government, and yet they are subject to our laws and our restrictions. We also get unintelligent people, I use that phrase lightly, literacy tests, for example, we've seen them many times over U.S. history because it's always been used to disenfranchise black or mentally deficient voters. New York in the early 1900s, for example, had a law where you had to present proof that you passed the 8th grade or take a test, which 15% of people failed. Literacy tests were not banned by Congress until 50 years ago in 1975. Isn't that ridiculous? Absolutely ridiculous. And another interesting one that I think is kind of funny, unhappy people are barred from voting in roundabout ways. Studies in the US, UK, and China have demonstrated that happier people are more likely to engage in political activity like donating, community work, voting, at an average rate of 2% increase in likelihood to vote in an upcoming election for every 1% increase in life satisfaction. So, the more happier you are, the more likely you are to go out and vote. Specifically, if someone enjoys a personal little economic boom, they're likely to go out and vote for that incumbent because they're like, yes, this is the reason that I am successful. Which tracks with how some people held their nose and voted for Trump despite being dissatisfied, because they were dissatisfied with what they perceived to be Biden's economy. Like, Trump didn't really gain a significant swath of voters from 2020, but he did gain some because a lot of people were like, yeah, Biden fucked our economy. the president doesn't have that much sway, but also they do have some. So, I mean, some of the fear is a little validated, but whatever. Studies actually out of China have actually shown that increases in voter participation along with increase in life satisfaction has been happening in recent decades, according to the National Library of Medicine. Some studies actually indicate that voting may make people happy, which kind of makes sense when you feel like you're contributing to your community and that you have control over your life. But depressed people are actually more likely to abstain from voting because, depression kind of makes you not want to get out of bed and not really give a shit about life. So, I mean, why are you going to care to go out and vote? I also remember seeing this quote. I can't remember exactly what it is, but effectively it says that when poor people are just struggling to make ends meet on the day-to-day, who gives a shit about going out and voting? Who gives a shit about democracy? Who gives a shit? I'm literally just trying to make sure I can survive until tomorrow. So that's where my kind of take is when it comes to people not voting. I feel like that is a fully valid option, but a lot of people in the US seem to really disagree. Like, if you're not voting, then you are the reason that this country sucks. And it's like, I feel like if anything, those people who aren't voting have probably a lot of ideas that they know damn well are never going to happen. Like, and especially like when you look at some people, it's like me, for example. I was born in 2001. George Bush was president. My family was poor then. I was poor during the Obama years. I was poor during the first Trump presidency. I was poor during the Biden administration. I am poor now. I'm looking at both of these parties have done nothing to materially help people around me. In fact, if anything, I've seen general levels of dissatisfaction increasing over this last 25 years almost. So, that's just one of my takes. That's kind of my more controversial take. But like I said, I think I've been able to clearly show you that there's a lot of ways where our democracy fails to really be democratic. We consistently bar people from voting in all kinds of roundabout ways. We have our smaller states are being more represented in the U.S. than the bigger states in the Senate. Even the Electoral College allows certain interests to take sway, even if the general population doesn't agree. That's kind of like why we have an example like where Trump won in 2016, even though Hillary won the popular vote, because of that Electoral College. And also one other quick fact, back when we established the House of Representatives and the Senate, the House of Representatives was actually meant to represent the rich, and the Senate was meant to be where the poor could cast their opinions. So notice how the Senate is significantly smaller than the House of Representatives. Those things continue. They have a legacy that has continued into this day, and if we are not going to be looking at these things genuinely, then I feel like we can't really say anything that we have is democratic. We may strive for democracy, but we fundamentally lack it, and even just the basic political democracy spectrum. That said, next week I do plan to actually talk about workplace democracy a little bit more, and then for the final part of this series, I'm hoping I want to actually talk about what democracy looks like in some of these countries that we think of as undemocratic. So, I guess stay tuned for that. And if you have any suggestions for future video topics that you'd like me or Grace to discuss, please drop them down in the comments. Make sure you keep the comment section respectful. We're gonna be civil here. You don't have to agree with everybody, but you gotta be nice. That's the basis here. So until next time, I will see you then. Bye.